I'm Fantappie. You're listening to the TCF World podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the latest round of popular protests that have broken out in Iraq and Egypt. I'm joined by Maria Fantappie and Michael Wahid Hanna. Thank you both for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks.
In the last few weeks or in the last month, we've had some really unexpected rounds of major, massive public protest and pretty unprecedented response in Iraq and Egypt. Some people have tried to liken this to a second round of the Arab revolts or another Arab Spring. I am less clear on what I think is going on, which is why I asked both of you to come on the podcast and help us figure out what is happening and then try to make sense of it. I think we should start with the fresher protests, which are still going on at the time of this recording in Iraq. Maria, tell us what exactly is happening with this popular revolt.
Well, thank you for having me, Tanasi. The protest started on October 1st. And are still ongoing until now. They have started, let's say that the trigger of this protest has been the announcement of the Prime Minister's decision to demote a very popular general who was a national hero and commander who led the war against ISIS and the liberation of Mosul, Abdul Wahab al-Saadi. And then from that moment on, the news went viral on social media. And of course, already there was a lot of simmering discontent, not vis-a-vis of this government in particular, but in vis-a-vis of every single government that has governed Iraq in the last 5 to 6 years. And these are accumulated grievances of people, largely young Iraqis, who see the political class who took over power after 2003 as having failed to provide governance, to provide good services, but more generally, really to provide prospects for an entire generation of millennials who is now grown up enough to be aware of this and to suffer from the consequences of this.
So epic governance failure and a sort of, not spiritual, but a sort of ideological failure to offer some hope for the future for Iraq's growing population. There was a lot of expectation that protests would break out this summer in a repeat of the previous summer's protests in Basra. And lots of Iraq experts and Iraqi politicians were crossing their fingers about whether the government would get through the summer. So I don't know if you can answer this, but how come the protests didn't break out during the hot, uncomfortable, miserable summer, and then unexpectedly a month after the end of summer exploded so forcefully? What was the trigger?
There is a reason for that, is that popular protests cannot be predicted because they come together only as a result of several number of variables. There is always a trigger, and often this trigger has been one of the expression of this failure of governance, meaning like last summer during the protest in Basra, it was the crisis of water, but in other cases it was about scandals and corruption. So the triggers were different. In this time, the trigger, as I said, it was the demotion of this very popular general. But again, the elements can come together at any point and in different locations of the country. So it's very actually unpredictable to say when they will happen. What, however, is predictable is to say that there is an unaddressed problem of disengagement from the political leadership vis-a-vis of the Iraqi society. So this government, as the previous one, it's sitting into the green zone, and which is, into the government buildings, and it's continuing on with very traditional way of governing the country, which is through basically clientelist redistribution of oil generated resources, and also done through a massive and very dysfunctional bureaucracy that really doesn't serve its population. So this way of governing the country has been going on even before it's been going on since 2003, and it has remained the same despite several calls for reform. So several sections of the society, in particular the young people, who are the large demographic majority of the Iraqi society, nearly the 67% of it, of course, they suffer of the consequences of this disengagement, and therefore protests become a different point and a way to actually express this sense of disillusion and this sense of really also disappointment vis-a-vis of a political class and of a system which they don't see to have a stake into. And they feel that the protests are the only way actually in which they can put pressure on this political class to the river.
So in a way, an amorphous explosion of rage, but one that's intended maybe without a specific agenda to pressure the governing class to acknowledge Iraq's population and its needs. Is there an organizing force behind these protests? I mean, they're in almost every Shia part of the country rose up with unbelievable force and bravery.
So it's actually quite interesting to see that protests, they are effective in shaking the political establishment, because as it happened also in this case, they actually send shockwaves to the government and also create an entire political crisis. And so in that they are effective. However, they're less effective in translating into a sort of a roadmap or like for engagement really with the government, in which the government then can be held accountable. So the pattern that always happened in the past since 2015, when the largest protests happened until now, is that there is this wave of protest. The government actually respond with stopgap measures, cosmetic reforms, and repression. And then there is a moment in which the protests are appeased, and then after several months, the protests return.
So are there leaders or parties that are sponsoring this?
Again, like the protest movement is actually leaderless. So there is no leaders, because what happens is that every time that the government tried actually to engage with the representative of the protest, these representatives were seen as co-opted by the government, and therefore they lost actually the legitimacy of the protest movement as a whole. So this movement proceeds as a movement that first wants to stay outside the political process, does not want to engage into the elections, and also does want to continue to be leaderless. Of course, there is like coordinators, people who are actually social media influencers, who starts up social media campaigns and start to actually mobilize people in specific location of the city and over specific issues. And so there are definitely coordinators, and there is also a quite organized civil society community that supports the movement. But again, also the movement is made of people that are not necessarily part of the upper middle class civil society. It's also made of lower middle class and not necessarily educated people who are simply disenfranchised, so even economically. So it's a very, there is a lot of difference within this movement. So the problem now that the protester will have to face is really how to find at least intermediaries, not leaders, but intermediaries through which actually in some way create channels of engagement with state bureaucracy and with government agency.
What about the government's response? I mean, with more than 100 people killed, thousands injured, is this characteristic of the violence with which the state has responded to protests in Iraq, or is this a new, darker turn?
So the level of repression has been unprecedented because over 100 people, or at least 110 people, have been killed. There are also members of the security forces within this number, but the large majority of this number includes actually protesters. The fact that these protests were particularly deadly, it's for several reasons. First of all, because in the previous protest, several political actors and religious actors like Muqtada Sadr and also the highest religious authority, the Ayatollah Ali Sistani, functioned or served as a sort of leaders in this movement and organized the movement. In this case, they could not do so because their political capital had been already exhausted previously when they had promised to the protesters that they would have pressured the government to deliver change, while this change didn't happen. The second reason why this repression was particularly strong is that the prime minister, it's a figure that in some way it's weaker compared to the previous prime ministers in terms of political party support. He's still dependent on several strong political parties in parliament who are also having a high-level position in the security establishment. So what probably has happened is that the prime minister weakness combined with the usual, with the sort of culture of repression that also still exists within the Iraqi security service, especially in the Ministry of Interior, has left the security official in charge of really dealing with the protester. The security official mindset is that one of securitizing the process and prioritize repression over engagement. And that actually led to a bloody, one of the, I will say it's the highest toll of casualties since 2003 in terms of popular protest.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk to Michael Wahid Hanna about what's been happening in Iraq, and then Michael and Maria in the third part of this conversation are going to try and help us make sense of what this means for authoritarian resurgence or popular prospects for popular revolt. We'll be right back.
At a time when the focus of politics is on being the loudest voice and not the most informed, the Century Foundation delivers thoughtful, evidence-based policy leadership with purpose. I'm Lucy Muirhead, Chief Strategy Officer at the Century Foundation. We work to reduce inequality, foster opportunity, and promote peace and security, carrying on a tradition that TCF's founder began in 1919. In the century ahead, we'll continue to prioritise rigour over reactivity, elevate the best ideas and most diverse voices, and never lose sight of what it takes to make an impact.
I'm Fantappie Kambanis. You're listening to the TCF World podcast. I'm talking to Maria Fantappie and to Michael Wahid Hanna about the latest revival of popular protest in the Arab world. We've been hearing about what happened in Iraq over the past few weeks, and now we're going to turn to Michael to learn more about this uprising, if we're going to call it that happened in Egypt at a historical period when everyone who I was hearing from was saying that it was impossible to imagine people in Egypt ever protesting again because of the levels of repression. What happened there?
Well, it's interesting because in Iraq, we would say that the protests were predictable and the response was unpredictable in the level of repression. In Egypt, it is the protest that was unpredictable and the response that was predictable. It did catch a lot of people, including me, off guard because, as you say, the levels of repression are such that popular protest is a very dangerous endeavor. Alongside that repression is the very active destruction of organized political life. It's near impossible for political opposition to exist, to organize, and to mobilize. And for those reasons, it seemed very unlikely that Egypt could face another moment like it did in 2011. The big lesson that the security establishment took from the mobilization and popular uprising of January 25th is that they would never allow those conditions to exist again. And by those conditions, I mean the incremental change that happened over many years. Beginning really in 2000 until 2011, Mubarak effectively allowed for safety valves, controlled opposition politics. But all of these incremental steps effectively expanded the political imagination of Egyptians and led to the events of 2011.
So since 2013, there's been literally no safety valves allowed, and the political imagination has been systematically walled off by the authoritarian regime of Sisi. And yet, tell us what we saw happen and what triggered it, and how in the hell did that get through this supposedly impregnable authoritarian wall?
Yeah, and some of the people that were most shocked were the activist class of 2011 to 2013, because they weren't part of this latest round of protest. The one new variable that is notable are these recordings that have been making their way into Egypt by a former contractor with the military named Muhammad Ali. He is effectively airing the corrupt business practices of the Egyptian military and laying this bare in unverified ways, but in believable ways, and capturing a huge audience. He's laying bare the corruption that he alleges exists in Sisi's Egypt. And part of the authoritarian bargain of Sisi was that yes, he's coming in with something like an iron fist. He is going to rein in the chaos and the potential for real dangerous fragmentation that other countries in the region have experienced, and that this tight leadership was going to produce results. And in fact, what we've seen since really 2013, 2014, when he formally became president, is austerity, but there's been no payoff. And so it is austerity with no job growth. Inflation is coming down, but there's been very serious inflation. So the economic prospects of for people remain quite dim. And
so this tracks what Maria was telling us about in Iraq, a bleak present and no prospects for future improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. Egypt needs to produce, I think the estimate from the IMF is 700,000 new jobs a year just to keep up with population growth. There is no payoff. And so, we've known that there is increasing discontent. The material conditions for people's lives are bleak. Yet it is surprising that this formed into something like a popular protest. Now, we shouldn't get carried away.
I mean, how big were they? How?
Yeah, I mean, these were scattered protests, not just in Cairo, so throughout Egypt, which is also interesting and surprising. But it's hard to imagine something like this because of its leaderless nature, because of the fierce repression, and I'll talk about this in a second, that accompanied this latest round of protests. It's hard to imagine this being something sustained. So in terms of the government's response, they have been extremely heavy-handed in ways I think that have shocked people who have become accustomed to repression. Some of this took the form of rounding up a kind of the usual suspects. So people like Ala Abdel Fattah, who have no relation.
So activists from 10 years ago who haven't been active at
Absolutely.
all recently.
And then other sort of notable opposition figures, people like Khalid Dawood, a former spokesman for an opposition political party, Hassan Nafa, a politically engaged political science professor, have been thrown into jail. In some ways as a warning to others, but also as a kind of indiscriminate response to the kind of outbreak of opposition, an attempt to squelch the opportunity for political figures, intellectuals, leaders, to use the protests as a way to create political space in Egypt. There's also been indiscriminate arrests. So checkpoints in the street, people, plainclothes police checking the phones of random people, looking at their social media feeds to see if they contain opposition content. And those kinds of spot checks have led to arrests. And so there have been thousands of arrests since this outbreak of protests. And I think it's frankly, it's such the scope is such that it has, I think, surprised some people, and it's the first time this regime has come really face to face with this kind of discontent.
We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to try and make sense of these two developments.
What exactly would a progressive foreign policy look like in the Middle East? The lines of critique are clear. Providing realistic policy proposals is a whole other thing, and much more difficult. I'm Dan Ben-Aim, and with my colleagues at the Century Foundation, we're trying to ask and answer the hard policy questions and come up with specific proposals that move the ball forward. You can see our ideas and join the conversation yourself at our website, tcf.org.
I'm Fantappie Kambanis. You're listening to the TCF World Podcast. I'm here with Maria Fantappie and Michael Wahid Hanna talking about the newest iteration of Arab revolts or uprisings or the latest Arab Spring. It seems to me from listening to both of you talk that there's one big common thread here and one big difference. And the common thread is that there just is not a political avenue for people to seek any policy change. And so protests break out because of the absence of any political process. And the big difference seems to be that Egypt is engaged in an experiment of trying to create a zero politics environment, a place where there's literally no political space. And in Iraq, I'm curious if this sounds right to you, Maria, the ruling class is trying to figure out how to manage discontent in a system where they can't erase politics because there's simply too much openness and pluralism in people's ability to express things, even if they don't actually share power.
Yes, the situation is it has definitely that difference. In Iraq, you have a political scene where even within the three main communities, you have differences. So in particular, within the Shia community, already even in during last parliamentary elections, the Shia community was competing. There were competing factions within. So it is a political scene which is very diverse, where also, or at least diverse, where also some actors that are like Muqtada Sadr and its movement have really tried to sort of translate into a political project what the protest movement actually want, or at least the discontent of the protest movement. But I would say that in the two cases, despite even in Iraq there is this pluralism that you were referring to, even in the case of Iraq, we are at the sort of moment of impasse, because despite all this cycle of protests in 2015, we have not yet found a way out from this. And what we see that is very dangerous is that every time that protests break out, then they become the clashes between protesters and security forces, and the level of anger becomes stronger and stronger, and it becomes less and less containable, even for the government to carry on just with cosmetic reform or clientelist redistribution of concessions. So this doesn't work anymore. So I think that despite that pluralism, because the movement of the street does not want to engage in politics, at least with this politics, we still are are in an impasse that has to be yet resolved.
Two things I want to quickly ask you to respond to, Maria. And we were both in Iraq a few weeks ago, and we were there the day Abdul Wahab al-Saadi was fired, and saw him on stage at the Rafidain dialogue. And the two things that struck me subsequently watching these protests break out. One is the way in which this particular round of protests is an entirely Shia affair, right? The earlier protests were, there were Sunni protest camps, there were secular communists working with Shia. There was a sort of gloss of every community in the country being represented. And this time, the Sunnis have intentionally stayed home, I think, to avoid provoking the wrath of the security service or being somehow tainting the movement with some, imputation that it's ISIS related or sectarian. So it's almost entirely Shia taking the streets and then being killed by Shia security services. So I'm interested in what the significance of that is. And related to that, I heard a lot of people disturbingly saying to me, and these not important people, just sort of regular Iraqis, saying, you know what, we'd like to have a Sisi here in Iraq because our muhassasa system, our spoil system of every party taking its slice has frozen us in a deep freeze for 16 years. Nothing seems to change it. No election, no protest, no foreign pressure, no domestic pressure. Let's have a strong man who can at least, start delivering some of the things that we're being deprived of. And that surprised me. So I'm curious how that relates and what you heard along those lines.
Yeah, I will be careful actually to see this protest as a strictly Shia protest within for instance, the civic activist movement. It is in Baghdad, which is a mixed populated city, of course, predominantly Shia, but still mixed populated. You had, any sort of also non-Shia. It's a secular movement where different people from different sect and ethnicity actually participate. So this was not a Shia mobilization alone, but it is true that yes, the Sunni provinces in this case they stayed silent, not because they don't share the same sentiments of disappointment, but because also not only the Sunni provinces, actually also some of the Shia main cities like Basra, who had experienced just a year ago a huge uptick in protest. Actually, there was not such a huge mobilization as people predicted. So I think that the lens to understand this is that in some areas, including predominantly Sunni areas, but also Shia areas, the fear of repression kept people staying home. In other areas, wherever instead it was possible to go in the street, there was this, and wherever there was actually this coordination or this social media influencer, and also a sort of like a minimal cell of coordination among protesters, then that the protests have happened. So I will stay away a bit from the sect paradigm to understand that. But for sure, and as of now, the Arab part of Iraq is largely, the Shia are a majority. And I think that now there is a search within the Shia community in Iraq to how to define the national identity. And there are different visions for that national identity. There are people who are Shia who are engaged in paramilitary groups that have links to Iran, and they want a type of Iraq that looks like much more like Iran. There is, on the contrary, large sections of the population, of the Shia population, that seek to have a specific Arab Shia identity, which is different from that one of the Iranians. And there are also sections of the Shia community which are engaged in cross-sectarian civic movements, who thinks that the sect and ethnic identity should not actually define the political system of the country. As for your last point concerning the search for a strong man, I think that sometimes there is a sort of confusion that people make, because when they speak to us also as foreigners, because I think that there is a search indeed for a leader. People, they want actually, they seek a leadership for the country, a leadership that has a vision for the country. And this is why the personality of this commander, who is Abdul Wahab al-Saidi, who is a very quiet man, in fact, who does not like to speak to media, who is not necessarily speaks so much, but he's someone who is a symbol and who has actually performed his national duty with integrity, people look at this as a symbol and as a leader. So people seek that sort of leadership. I don't think that people, they want actually a new Saddam or a Sisi leading the country. On the contrary, once Nouri al-Maliki, a previous prime minister, was in place and he was accused of authoritarian style of governance, there was a lot of internal opposition against it. So I think that people, what they seek is a leader or a leadership which is different from that one that they have suffered from since 2003, and who has the ability really to establish a different pact with its society, not on the basis of the sect identity, not on the basis of the clientelist redistribution of goods, but on the basis of the of citizenship.
Michael, is authoritarianism still retain the gloss and legitimacy that it thinks it does?
Well, in some ways, it's not about gloss of legitimacy; it's sustainability. I think there was a good deal of wishful thinking. Really because of how bleak the situation is in Egypt, about what these protests mean and what they could mean for the future. In distinction to Iraq, where the kind of authoritarian repression of the protests was coupled with a political response that clearly internalized the idea that this was a crisis. Adel Abdel Mahdi addresses the nation, is talking about some of these grievances, not dealing with them effectively, but at least acknowledging them.
A bad response that at least acknowledges that a response is demanded.
In Egypt, it is a course with no corrections. It is one ratchet, which is increasing repression. And the response is unbending. It is simply to escalate repression. There is no way for popular movements, in this case, to have their grievances aired and internalized by the political system in a way that produces policy change. So what we do know is that this course forward is going to produce poor results for Egypt. The macroeconomic picture looks much better than it did in 2013, 2014. But again, there is this huge gap between that macro picture and the impact that has had on individual lives, particularly of the poor. We have growing inequality, growing poverty, and yet. We shouldn't then automatically assume that this negative trajectory is indicative of an unsustainable political situation. It might just be a disaster that remains sustainable for some time to come.
Right. I mean, terrible governance can be sustainable, and that's unfortunate, but it's true. And I mean, throughout the region, and especially in the two cases that we're talking about, we've seen now a generation in Iraq's case of turmoil and change, and in Egypt's case, you could argue back to also 2000, the protests, the Palestinian protests in Egypt that began the cycle of protests that we're still witnessing today. In both cases, you put this nicely, Michael. You said, a course without a correction. These are rigid systems. Remediating them does not necessarily require democracy, although that's my personal preference. But in both cases, we have a system. In Iraq's case, it's a communal spoils system. In Egypt's case, it's military rule, which govern poorly and which are immune to political pressure. They've in very different ways walled themselves off. And I guess I'm surprised by how well they can weather these kinds of protests. And I wonder if is there a point where popular protest actually means they have to change something, or is this just a cost of doing business if you're a bad government that's willing to kill its own citizens?
Well, it depends on what the real vulnerabilities are. I mean, I've thought for a long time that the greatest vulnerability to regime sustainability for this current configuration of leadership in Egypt is internal. because of the lack of organized political power, because of the lack of real opposition and dissent. It is the internal divisions that we know exist within the security establishment that might create vulnerability. Those can work in parallel, and the popular protests can have a kind of synergistic effect to embolden actors, but it's a black box. And while we know that there are divisions, none of this has emerged in a way that has created political space. None of this has emerged in a way to really change politics in the country. So, a lot of the hope placed on, a new hero general, which, surprisingly, I've heard talk about, to say, a coup would be fine. It can't be any worse than it is now. And that's kind of the only prospect we have for political change.
And we keep learning that it can always get worse.
Yeah, exactly. It's a reflection of the hopelessness of the political situation, but it also reflects some wishful thinking. I mean, we don't know exactly what's happening within the security establishment, and we'd sort of be the last people to know about something like that. But it's reflective of this dead end, and a sense that there is no way to shift the course of political thought, of economic planning. It's a real dire situation, and Egypt seems immune to both external pressure, which has dramatically decreased in recent years, particularly with the coming of the Trump administration, and is unwilling to countenance the possibility of that kind of bottom-up domestic pressure. So I'm pretty pessimistic.
What about you, Maria?
I am very concerned as of now of this dead end that Michael was mentioning, because also, as you also mentioned, actually, even the system in Iraq, despite being more open, it is immune to change in some way.
It's like a closed loop in a way.
Yeah, it's in a loop, and also it's immune to change because it doesn't know how to change. So the outcome and the end result is the same. So I think that here we all the time speak about what the government and the political class has not done. I think that we have to look in both boxes, in the box of the government and into the also box of the street, because also this street protest, in a way or in another, we can say that despite having put pressure, they really haven't had any impact in changing, in meaningfully changing something within the system of Iraq. So I think that the government, for sure, it needs to get out from this idea where you have to respond to demands, because the protesters do not have specific demand. They have so many demands, and these demands can change anytime, can change also depending on the location where the protest happens. So you will never end of satisfying demand. And when you satisfy demands, you actually sort of appease some and dissatisfy others. So this system of dealing with the society where you, for example, do like Prime Minister Adel Mahdi did, which say, okay, we will offer these salaries, this stipendium to the unemployed. We will appease the tribes in the south with certain concessions. We will give housing units to others. It's not a sustainable way of dealing with the process, because again, you will make some people happy and you will make some other happy, or you will make some other think that in order to access more resources, you have to go and protest as well. But this is like, it's something that has no end, basically. In
a way, the protests reflect the pathology of the system. So they're asking for just a different distribution of the stuff, and not for a change in this sick spoil system and its replacement with something that's more democratic or more responsive or less corrupt. So if they're appeased, it's just changing the shape of a tumor, basically, rather than trying to cure it.
Well, I mean, there are some elements in the demonstrators, I think those ones especially who really are economically disenfranchised, that do not necessarily that they might think, as you said, that they might think, okay, once they receive those concessions, they will be staying at home and they will not protest, at least temporarily. But I think that there is also a meaningful part of these demonstrators who do not necessarily see redistribution of goods as something that they are seeking for, but they're looking for. They're really searching for something different, which is a different way of the authorities to engage with the society. I mean, if you are, to give you an example, a young 23 years old Iraqi who wants to establish its own company in Baghdad, it will be very difficult for you to have to get the start with the startup on your own without dirtying your hand into making agreements with some political parties who will and some militias who will not attack your office, some political parties who will start to give you money to sustain your project. And if you actually don't want to play that dirty game, you need to step outside it. And to step outside it, you need to have, independent funding. You need to have to be, to be also fearless in front of potential threat that you might receive. So people are tired also of this type of things, of this cooptation game in which they are involved every single day in every single thing, from a startup establishment to asking for a driving license. Everything has a price in terms of dignity, a price in terms of always asking people to basically bend their head and ask for favors to a powerful political party. So people are really sick about that rather than asking for more resources, I think. But again, this is the side of the government, but also the side of the demonstrators. There is a responsibility from their side, because there are certainly elements in it, and specifically those upper middle class, educated activists who are already engaged in private sector initiatives which are autonomous from the political party, and also civic initiatives on different themes, that from governance to water redistribution to women's rights, so on and so forward. All these activists, they are already organized under a platform. And I think that for them, it will be very important to play a sort of role of intermediaries between the government and larger protester movements, because they are those ones who are better place in doing that, being on the one hand very much up to date with what the issues of that people suffer are, and also in contact with the larger sections of the society through social media, and at the same time also more able to understand how to actually partner with the government on specific governance initiatives, reconstruction initiatives in ISIS-liberated areas. So again, here the point is to find channel of cooperation between the government and these sections of the society who actually want to engage in determining what their future will be, what the future Iraq will be, but they don't want to be doing so according to the same rule of the games that those political parties since 2003 until now have established.
And nearly a decade since the first protesters in the Arab world in Tunisia shocked their fellow members of the region by going to the streets and risking death to call for the fall of their regime, we are still seeing people risking their lives to do the same thing. And two constants. One, people seem to be endlessly brave and willing to die to make these kinds of calls, and governments seem to be endlessly willing to govern poorly in order to hold on to their prerogatives, and really unwilling to adjust even slightly to come up with better ways of governing. We'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much for joining the conversation, Maria and Michael.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.
And you've been listening to the TCF World Podcast. I'm Thanasi Kambanis. Until next time. TCF World has been brought to you by the Century Foundation, a progressive public policy think tank that seeks to foster opportunity, reduce inequality, and promote security at home and abroad. For more information about our work, please visit tcf.org or follow us on Twitter and Facebook.